The aggressive moves of Russia in Eastern Europe and China in the Pacific are forcing the US and its allies to take drastic measures, especially recently as Taiwan tensions in the South China Sea escalate. The US and UK tighten their measures both in Europe, in the Pacific, and in the Baltics. While experts emphasize the risks of Russia's aggression towards the Baltics and Scandinavian countries, NATO superpowers are evolving the Ukrainian army into the best in the world. The key links in the chain of events that could shake the global balance of power are the escalations in the Crimea, in the Black Sea, the Gulf of Finland and the Baltics, and the Taiwan Strait in the Pacific. In these regions, the US allies and Russia somehow come face to face among these regions. Right now it is Crimea that directly affects and worries Vladimir Putin. Although Crimea is the legitimate territory of Ukraine, it has been under Russian annexation for 9 years. While Ukraine's pressure on Crimea has been increasing in recent months, Ukrainian allies are making every effort to strengthen this pressure, while the US Army retired General Ben Hodges emphasizes that it's not that difficult for Ukraine to take back Crimea. The UK Army is turning 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers in total into the world's most elite special operations unit. These 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers trained in the UK will be the striking team for Ukraine's large-scale Crimean offensive against Russia. Signs that a Ukrainian offensive is imminent are evident when Vladimir Putin visits the occupied part of Kherson, and NATO boss Jens Stoltenberg visits Ukraine and checks in on troops. Let's look at the adventure of 60,000 elite Ukrainian soldiers for the Crimean offensive, the security measures in the region, and the general situation. The second round of the war between Russia and Ukraine is about to begin. The address of the second round is quite remarkable. With the warning of the weather, it seems inevitable that counterattacks will start and that both sides of the war will now turn to the southern front lines. Both armies continue their preparations for a counterattack. Russia wants to seize the entire Donbass region and Ukraine wants to take back the lost lands. But at the moment, the Crimean Peninsula, as the most strategic target, is attracting all the attention. The plans of the Ukrainian forces to seize the peninsula created a bombshell effect on the agenda. Since last summer, Ukraine's surprise ally has trained large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers, becoming a facilitator of Kiev's major Crimean offensive plan. Let's take a closer look at this critical Crimean plan and what Ukraine's surprise ally did to make it happen. Tanks sent by the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom in the last month are expected to be effective in Ukraine's counterattack. It is an undeniable fact that in addition to tanks, trained soldiers also play an effective role in the counterattack in war. That's why the UK is training soldiers serving in the Ukrainian army. Yes, as we mentioned, Ukraine's surprise ally, the UK, is one of the protagonists of this striking Crimean plan of Kiev. Nearly 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained in the UK by British forces since last summer, but the pace picked up considerably after Prime Minister Rishi Sunak increased it from 10,000 to 20,000 a month earlier this year. In a frenzy ahead of President Vladimir Zelensky's spring offensive against Russian forces, the UK is training 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers every 5 weeks. Trainers from Canada, Denmark, Finland, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Australia, and New Zealand were brought in to assist the British trainers during the training. Ukrainian soldiers are taught a range of combat skills such as rural and urban warfare and counter IED in 35-day training missions. These combat skills include survival in a hostile environment, medical trauma, weapon handling, marksmanship, and armed conflict law. Also training areas including Salisbury Plain, Hankley, Common Longmoor, Catterick, and Otterburn have been fully taken over for duty at Salisbury Plain. Ukrainian soldiers are taught to command artillery and coordinate air strikes using AS-90 self-propelled artillery donated by the UK. AS-90 self-propelled artillery 155mm mobile artillery system is capable of firing up to 6 rounds per minute. For this reason, as training is very important. The large area in Wiltshire is also used for armored infantry training, live shooting with general-purpose machine guns, and specialist sniper training. After the UK's donation of thousands of PM guns, sniper rifles, and ammunition, at Longmoor in Hampshire, Ukrainian soldiers are guided on their routine patrols, while at Hankley Common in Surrey, they take part in attacks and mock Russian positions during the dawn strikes. They are also taught to fly helicopters, use drones at night, and engage in close combat in simulated villages. A final week-long exercise testing the training of Ukrainian soldiers is being held in Salisbury. Meanwhile, a top military source confirmed that Ukrainian training has now become the main priority of the Ministry of Defense. In fact, all this affected the routine training of UK battalions, but both UK soldiers and Ukrainian troops have to face the storm. Meanwhile, the UK also became the first ally to train its Ukrainian pilots in NATO airspace tactics. But Rishi Sunak drew the red line in providing fast jets. The support for Ukraine is not limited to training soldiers. As part of the accelerated support package, the UK will send a fleet of Challenger 2 tanks as 90 self-propelled 155mm guns to Ukraine, hundreds of armored and protected vehicles, dozens of unmanned aerial systems to support Ukrainian artillery, 100,000 artillery shells, GMORS rockets, Starstreak air defense missiles, as well as 600 Brimstone missiles will be delivered to Ukraine. In addition, the UK will send armor-piercing shells containing depleted uranium to Ukraine for use in Challenger 2 battle tanks. Such shells are quite effective in defeating modern tanks and armored vehicles. Depleted uranium is a standard component of controversial anti-armor weapons that NATO countries have used for decades. The density of depleted uranium makes it an effective material for piercing heavy armor on the battlefield and is used by many armies. In short, Ukraine is trying to strengthen its army by using all the means before the counterattack. Here again, his Western friends come into play. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, Ukraine's goal is to take back the lost lands. It's unclear where the weight of Ukraine's impending counter-offensive will fall, but a successful attack on the southern Kherson and Zaporizhia regions could open the way to the Crimea and cut off the Russian supply route to the peninsula. That's why the key piece of land here is Crimea as it is known. The leader of Kiev has often expressed his insistence on taking back Crimea. Zelensky's insistence gained meaning with the plans made. Let's take a closer look at Ukraine's plan for Crimea. Ukraine has outlined a plan for how it can reclaim control of Crimea from Putin's hands. Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, published the plan ahead of the counterattack that Kiev is planning this spring. The plan includes dismantling the massive 19-kilometer bridge between Crimea and Russia, which has been dubbed Europe's longest bridge. In October, a truck bomb signifying recently damaged the bridge, and Russia flagged Ukrainian military intelligence. Ukraine did not claim responsibility for the bomb, but Ukrainian authorities have repeatedly threatened to hit the bridge in the past. Also in the Danilov plan, he proposed that all Ukrainians working for the Moscow-appointed administration in Crimea be prosecuted. Danilov said that some of the employees will face criminal charges, while others will lose their state pensions and be barred from public jobs. According to the plan, Russians who moved to Crimea after 2014 will be deported. Meanwhile, all real estate deals made under Russian rule would be voided. It is difficult to predict when Kiev will realize the Crimean plan. However, looking at the successes achieved on the front lines, Crimea is not an impossible target for Ukraine. In short, Crimea is Ukraine, and one day this historical peninsula will return to its real owner. The Ukrainian armed forces, equipped with Western equipment, stopped the advance of Russian troops on the front lines. At the same time, the success of the Kiev forces broke the morale and motivation of the Russian army. As long as his Western friends are with Zelensky, it seems almost impossible for the Russian leader to turn this war in his favor. We will wait and see how the strengthening of ties between the UK and Ukraine will affect Putin. The war between Ukraine and Russia has moved to a completely different dimension, with the USA and the West presenting their powerful war technologies to Ukraine, especially US-made air defense systems. Anti-tank and anti-ship systems and armored vehicles have been game-changers in Ukraine's freedom struggle. The Russian army witnessed the power of Western systems on land and was unable to break through the Ukrainian defenses. However, very serious struggles took place for air supremacy over the Ukrainian skies. Although the Russian army has very powerful long-range missiles and warplanes, it has not been able to gain air superiority. So how is it that the Ukrainian army is now able to hold the advantage in the airspace against the Russians? The US military has provided the Ukrainian military with over $30 billion in military aid, elevating the Ukrainian military to one of the most capable armies in the world, especially the US-made anti-aircraft HIMA and PADS. Medium and long-range air defense complexes became the guardian angels of the Ukrainian skies. Air defense systems are seen as heroes of the war between Ukraine and Russia, especially the American-made NASAMS is much more prominent among them. In particular, medium-range NASAMS air defense systems have become the protectors of Ukrainians who are facing Russian missile terror in Ukrainian cities. Recent reports show that NASAMS has achieved legendary success against Russian missiles. The Ukrainian Air Force exhibited the work of the NASAMS air defense system. A video of the operation of this air defense system was published on social media. The content of this video revealed a new record in the war. According to the video, NASAMS air defense systems in Ukraine destroyed a total of 100 Russian aircraft in 5 months. This figure was the highest and most effective result we have seen since the beginning of the war. NASAMS have long been stationed in and around the White House. Yes, right now, NASAMS are the most effective air defense systems protecting the White House and President Biden. Before, the Ukrainian forces included NASAMS air defense systems in its inventory. Russian troops managed to damage the infrastructures of cities in the eastern regions of Ukraine by 60%. However, after NASAMS came, the success of Russian offensive operations dropped drastically because this air defense system was working with 100% success rate. For this reason, Russia could not damage Ukrainian territory and cities, neither with fighter jets nor with unmanned aerial vehicles. Fixed and mobile low and medium altitude systems are of great importance, especially due to the recent increase in the dangers of UAV, drone, cruise missile and cruise missile drone mix. As we mentioned, the Ukrainian army manages to thwart Russian drones and other air attacks thanks to effective air defense systems such as NASAMS. So why have these systems been so successful, and how did NASAMS Ukrainian operators become inclined to use these systems? NASAMS can detect and track multiple targets at the same time thanks to its advanced radar system. This gives NASAMS a serious success rate, but the most effective feature of NASAMS is that it has dual-use AMRAAM missiles. Thanks to its dual-use concept, AMRAAM missiles provide operational advantages to the system and reduce costs. In addition, the training of NASAMS operators by the US is one of the factors that brings Ukraine to a serious level in air defense. The management and use of the system is quite easy compared to other types of air defense. The S-300 air defense system is much more complex than NASAMS, but NASAMS has a much higher success rate than the Russian S-300 air defense system. If you remember, in the past weeks, Russia launched a massive missile attack along the front line stretching from Lviv to Kherson. The Ukrainian Air Force announced that during these attacks, 34 Russian cruise missiles and Iranian-made drones were shot down using NASAMS systems. NASAMS, which provided an effective success rate in the eastern front lines of Ukraine, also reduced the damage rates in this region. If you remember, another striking achievement of NASAMS in this regard was the destruction of the Russian Su-35 fighter jet. This striking situation, which left the Russian forces in shock, was one of the greatest proofs of how successful NASAMS was. Russian Su-35 fighter jet was shot down by NASAMS air defense systems near Izium. The Russian pilot of the plane barely escaped with his life. After this news, NASAMS became the most feared dream of Russians because thanks to this air defense system, Ukrainian forces managed to shoot down a Russian Su-35 fighter jet for the first time. Considering that the unit cost of the Su-35 is about $85 million, the Russians are quite right to be afraid. NASAMS, produced in 1995, can fire missiles up to 30 kilometers. They also have a 120-kilometer radar tracking system. NASAMS was designed for the Royal Norwegian Air Force, but at the moment this powerful, successful defense system is almost perfectly protecting the Ukrainian territory from the Russians. In addition, thanks to its flexible mission configuration, it is a system that has proven to be interoperable with high-altitude and longer-range systems such as Patriot. Actually, this is a very important detail because the US administration has been considering sending Patriot air defense systems to the Ukrainian army for a long time. The fact that these two systems work in harmony seems to bring the Russians out of the war. In addition, the US administration also mentioned NASAMS air defense systems in its latest military aid package alongside the US. The Norwegian government recently announced plans to supply Ukraine with 2 complete NASAMS firing units. Norwegian Defense Minister Bjørn Arild Gram announced that he will send 2 NASAMS air defense systems to Ukraine in cooperation with the United States. Gram, stating that Ukraine urgently needs additional air defense equipment, expressed that his country will constantly help Ukraine in this regard, stating that the Ukrainian army will be trained in the use of NASAMS. Gram reminded that Norway had previously helped the USA in the delivery of NASAMS to Ukraine. Last October, the US delivered 2 NASAMS systems to Ukraine. Last November, Canada also announced that it would provide $500 million of military aid to Ukraine and announced that a significant part of this money would buy a NASAMS unit and missiles. Thanks to NASAMS, the Ukrainian army gained a serious advantage against the Russians in air defense. The most important reason why NASAMS is so effective is that it is mid-range. In other words, they are a total war icon in this regard, as UAVs usually carry out mid-range attacks. In short, while many countries have short-range air defense systems today, certain countries can develop long-range air and missile defense systems. In this context, studies have also been carried out on the need to fill the intermediate-range air defense gap, and as a result, a modular system such as NASAMS, which is the subject of this video, has emerged. Although America has an advanced long-range air defense system like the Patriot, we see that it uses the Norway-based NASAMS to protect important institutions in their capital, Washington. Because air defense systems are divided into 4 classes as very low altitude, medium altitude, and high altitude. Although the targets of most of these systems are similar, it is a necessity that they are specially developed for targets at different altitudes. In other words, there cannot be an understanding that there is no need for other air defense systems just because there is a high-altitude air defense system. Although these systems are generally ground-based, air defense systems in 4 classes are also important and complementary elements. When considered, all of them stand before us as separate requirements. For this reason, the Ukrainian armed forces need both more NASAMS and other long-range air defense systems. It is predicted that clashes will increase on the battlefield in Ukraine, especially with the air temperatures increasing much more. At the same time, the Russians are expected to increase their operations in missile and air strikes. For this reason, Ukrainian forces need to place effective defense systems such as NASAMS in the most strategic areas on their territory. For this, of course, the countries of the world need to provide military aid to Ukraine. There is a lot of news from the East. Here, the longer the battle for Bakhmut goes, the heavier both parties start relying on artillery support, as artillery proved to be extremely influential in stopping the enemy and also generating breakthroughs. Both Russians and Ukrainians started conducting intense counter battery operations. Russians quickly realized that they had big problems because not only is most of the Western artillery is out of their range, but Ukrainians also upgraded their armor and neutralized the threat of the most prevalent Russian counter battery weapon. Last time I told you that Ukrainians conducted a counterattack in the northern part of the region, pushed the Russians towards Rose Alley, and blew up the building of the Municipal Department of Culture in order to complicate Russian advances. I also told you that in order to break Ukrainian momentum, Russian forces started using massive air bombs, wiping out the residential area with small houses. The freshest report suggests that due to the intense artillery and aviation strikes, the northern part of the region became a gray zone. A Ukrainian fighter that took part in the recent Ukrainian counterattack reported that Ukrainians stepped back from one of the previously liberated streets to be able to hold the fence from more reliable positions. Looking at the geolocated footage, it is hardly surprising as the buildings next to the Rose Alley have been completely demolished. Ukrainians also finally stepped back from the train station as the ring around it became too tight. A Ukrainian fighter from the Adar battalion explained the situation and elaborated on the reasons for the retreat. As you remember, Ukrainians withdrew from the blocks north of the station quite rapidly and seemingly prematurely. But this move allowed Ukrainians to entice Russians to start storming the train station from the north, while Ukrainians held the fence in the high-rise buildings around it. After 10 consecutive days of unsuccessful assaults, Russians realized that the shortest way was not the fastest and started attacking from the south. This was when the situation became very inconvenient for Ukrainians, as there are no powerful positions on the southern line to hold off Russian flank attacks. In fact, this part of the residential area was reduced to rubble. Ukrainian artillery crews from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade were eliminating Russian forces' concentrations here, but some units still managed to cause trouble for some time. When Russians reached Hotel Transit from the south, the bridge had become too small and counterproductive to hold, and Ukrainians stepped back. Recent geolocated footage showed that Ukrainian artillery is already targeting Russian forces near the hotel and preventing them from using the intact houses. As usual, Ukrainians know which buildings are still suitable for establishing positions or local ammunition depots, so when they retreat, they closely monitor these positions. And once Russians assume them, they either blow up the building or hit it with artillery. Ukrainian artillery is also reducing Russian forces in the northern part of the region in a bid to match the intensity of Russian artillery fire in this area. Ukrainians shelled Russian positions so heavily that Russians could no longer maintain a permanent presence in this region. Recent geolocated footage showed Russian positions around what was left from the grain elevators, confirming that there is not much place to hide for long. That is why the situation became very dynamic here, and 1-hour clashes happen in the ruins to the north and another hour in ruins closer to the center. Russian sources also complain that Ukrainians are actively using Western artillery and especially HIMARS. Today's footage from the Bakhmut direction indeed confirms that Ukrainians are increasingly targeting Russian concentrations of manpower and equipment, and not only those located in Bakhmut but also Solder, Klinova, and Pokrovskaya. The reason why Russians are apprehensive about Western artillery is that it is usually stationed out of reach of their artillery, which does not allow them to conduct counter battery fire for the most part. Russians are using kamikaze drones in order to take out Ukrainian long-range artillery. Russian sources published a number of videos showing how their Lancets destroyed M777 and other artillery systems. However, this tactic very quickly became inefficient because Ukrainians learned how to catch these drones in order to prevent unpleasant surprises. Ukrainians started establishing nets on top of the artillery systems. Some Ukrainians even established nets on the machines themselves as the second layer of armor because it takes time to set up nets on a new position. making the artillery vulnerable during the position changes. Russians tried to adapt and started using highly skilled drone operators for counter battery missions who could attack artillery by using a more sophisticated trajectory. However, Ukrainians adapted to that as well and started creating all-round mobile cages. Russian forces struggled to mirror Ukrainian tactics because of the bureaucracy of the Russian Ministry of Defense, which only allows going by the book and is very stiff when it comes to innovation. Some volunteers started providing them with nuts regardless, but the extent to which it influences the situation is negligible. That is why, for the most part, Russians are relying on air defense, and such a heavy reliance on air defense puts a further strain on the availability of the systems, which forces them to spread them thinly and decreases the protection against concentrated strikes. Russians understand this, and they have already deployed as many of them as possible and even canceled the export of batteries to other countries. And the declining export of weapons in turn puts fiscal pressure on the state.